So how should the government and members of Parliament in the House of Commons be dealing with these proposals from the Senate? Let's go to the foyer of the House of Commons this evening, where we are joined by Sean Casey, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice. Michael Cooper is the Justice Critic for the Official Opposition, and Alistair McGregor is the NDP's Critic for Seniors. Good to see you all, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Mr. Casey, what is the government's view here on the Senate amendment? Let's start with the Senate amendment that restores essentially the language of the Supreme Court ruling in Carter, allowing suffering patients, even if they are not near death, to seek medical help to end their lives.
I think it's dangerous to talk about the amendment in isolation, quite frankly, because the Senate is still going through a process of other amendments. It's important to bear in mind that the particular amendment that has been adopted is one that was rejected at the Justice Committee and rejected on the floor of the House of Commons. It is one which, in isolation, would throw the balance out between the class of people to whom access should be provided and the appropriate safeguards for that class. If you broaden the class, should you not also look at the safeguards? And the Senate is doing that right now. So what I would say is
does that represent perhaps a window of compromise for the government here, that if there's something accompanying the broadening of the class, that the government might be open to it?
What I would say is that it quite frankly is too early to say. We need to see what the bill looks like when it comes back, and then see whether any of the items see whether there's anything new, quite frankly, because many of these issues have been discussed thoroughly at committee. They've been discussed thoroughly on the floor of the House of Commons. So is there anything that will come back from the Senate that will change the thinking? And I think until they've done their work, we should give it the respect it deserves.
Mr. Cooper, where does your party stand on this particular Senate amendment to delete the key requirement from the government's bill that a person's natural death be reasonably foreseeable?
Well, in our party, there is a free vote and there is a diverse range of views. That's why some Conservative senators supported the amendment, whereas others did not. In my opinion, I find the amendment troubling. I believe that the Supreme Court contemplated in Carter that physician-assisted dying should be the exception and not the rule. And I believe that this amendment doesn't satisfy that. I think it's far too broad. In fact, so broad is it that it would open the door to persons who are suffering simply from a mental illness, solely from a mental illness, to physician-assisted dying. And I don't believe that that is what the Supreme Court contemplated when they called upon Parliament to strike that balance between respecting individual autonomy and protecting vulnerable persons. What this amendment does is it puts vulnerable Canadians at risk, and I can't support it.
Okay. Mr. McGregor, what's your view and the NDP's view on how members of Parliament should be responding to these proposals coming from the Senate?
Well, Peter, I had the chance to go to the Senate Standing Committee on Constitutional Affairs when renowned constitutional lawyer and historian Peter Hogg was giving his expert testimony. And he focused with a laser-like focus on that offending part. His view of the matter was that any legislation passed by Parliament had to stick within the constitutional definitions laid out in the Carter case. And in his view, those offending sections were the problem, and he recommended that they be expunged entirely. This has been the position of our party consistently through the legislative process of the House of Commons. I was glad to see that amendment. It's unfortunate that the unelected Senate had to do the job that we parliamentarians were sent here to do on behalf of voters. But I will agree that we do have to wait until the Senate finishes its deliberations as a whole, and only then can we see what kind of a bill they're sending back to the House.
All right, Mr. Casey, we have there's lots of reporters up there, cameras up there. I'm not saying there's anything secret about it, but about the process. But you've been spotted, the ministers have been spotted, going back and forth to the Senate part of the center block to chat. Tell me what's happening behind the scenes, if you can, about where the government is trying to move this process forward, where you think it's heading.
Well, in terms of the discussions with the Senate, it's very much an information sharing process, quite frankly. Any senators that have questions, we're there to answer them. We respect the independence of the Senate and the work that they have to do. As you know, they're no longer in the caucus, so it's important to have these conversations so that they can do their work in an informed way. But in terms of negotiations and machinations, I'm not involved in any to the extent there are any. We're waiting as much as the reporters and as much as you are to see the product of their work.
So, Mr. Cooper, I mean, senators are suggesting if the House rejects the amendments they bring forward, including this one that you have problems with, coming from Mr. Joyal, but passed by the Senate as a whole, if you don't agree with their amendments, they will insist on it, setting up this back and forth between the two chambers of the House. Does it begin to make more sense now to and is it even reasonable to talk about, perhaps even at this point, sending the bill to the Supreme Court for a reference test to maybe resolve some of these issues?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to, first of all, wait and see what comes out of the Senate. There obviously are a lot of amendments that are before the Senate, and that debate will continue for the next several days. And once I see the amendments in their totality, I'll be able to make a decision as a parliamentarian whether I can support the bill or not support the bill. But based upon the amendment that was passed last night, it isn't, in my opinion, moving in the right direction. I was hopeful that the bill could be improved in the Senate, and perhaps that's still possible when we look at all of the amendments that come from the Senate, but it doesn't seem to be on the right track at this point. I think that what this does, though, further demonstrate in terms of the timeline that we're talking about and the fact that this could go on for weeks or arguably for months, although I'm very I'm confident or hopeful that it will be resolved in the next few weeks, is the fact that we have this legal vacuum that exists and the fact that the Minister of Justice never went to the Supreme Court to ask for an extension, and that has left everyone involved in a state of limbo while we here in the House and in the Senate try to settle on a piece of legislation.
All right, so so for Canadians watching, Mr. McGregor, where do you want parliamentarians to come down on this? If there's an impasse between the houses, the upper chamber and the House of Commons, then what?
Well, I think ultimately if this back and forth is what's going to happen, hopefully we'll establish some kind of a conference between both houses and they can iron it out. But what I will say, Peter, is that right now, because we have passed the June the 6th deadline, there are Canadians out there with grievous and irremediable medical conditions who are suffering intolerably, who now have the right to seek this, even if they are not near death. If we pass Bill C-14 with the foreseeable death clause, we are, in a sense, taking that right away from this group of Canadians, and that is simply going to tie us up in legal knots with the courts for years to come. And I think that is patently unfair, and you cannot morally justify that stance to those Canadians by forcing them through the court system. I want Parliament to do its job to stick within the constitutional parameters set out by the Supreme Court in the Carter case.
Mr. Casey, has your government looked a little bit further down the road than maybe the next couple of days? As you try to, I know you want to wait and see what the Senate brings back to the House, but if you end up in this impasse, in this standoff, have you talked about a plan for what the next step is? To Mr. McGregor, is it perhaps a conference? Is it some other way to resolve this?
Any detailed discussions would be premature. Also, it's important to bear in mind that this has been a free vote throughout. So any discussions would have that complicating overlay as well. I think that both at the Senate and in the House of Commons, there is an overriding will to have a federal law. So regardless of the outcome, regardless of the process, I think that the will is there. It's going to be difficult to achieve that. It's quite clear by what's taken place to date. But I do think the political will is there, and I remain optimistic that that we will, in short order, have a federal law.
All right, Mr. Cooper, quickly to you. Your leader expressed concerns today that this process is in many ways now being driven by the unelected Senate. You have a problem with that?
Well, it's before the Senate, and we just have to work and deal with the Senate. But quite frankly, before June 6th, there was a process for persons who wish to access physician-assisted dying. Now there is no process. Now we have chaos. We have, in some provinces, directives that have been issued to exempt health professionals from prosecution. We have the largest province, namely Ontario, that has not issued such a directive. We have Alberta with legislation that opens the door to mature minors. So this is really an untenable situation, and it was preventable. The minister could have applied to the Supreme Court before this very foreseeable chain of events occurred, and that would have at least provided certainty while we, over the next few weeks, deal with Bill C-14.
And Mr. supposes that the court would have said yes, which is anything but a certainty given given what they said the last time we went there.
Mr. McGregor, let me last question to you. We know the NDP's position on the Senate. Has that changed at all? A lot of people say the Senate's restored its image to a great degree with the depth of the conversation, its discussion it's having on this bill.
It is true that my party is not the biggest fan of the Senate. I'm still very concerned about its accountability to Canadians. But, this is the legislative process we currently operate by, and they are doing their job. I have to be fair to them. And it's nice to see that they are going to send the bill back to Parliament, to the House of Commons, with amendments that the NDP was fighting every step of the way. So I am glad to see that.
All right, gentlemen, the process continues to unfold. We'll continue to follow it, and you're an integral part of it, all of you, and I thank you for sharing your thoughts tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.